Okay, now I'm recording. Okay, thank you. So in recent years, there seems to have been an erosion in the public trust in science and in scientific expertise in general. And I know some academics, some famously so, who have expressed regret at having played too substantial a role in contextualizing and therefore maybe in demystifying science, or in taking too close look at the philosophical foundations of scientific claims. And so they're doing this kind of mea culpa for having contributed to this said erosion. I submit that there are grander social and political forces that are in action, and that in fact, the academic preoccupation may be a kind of manifestation.
אורן, תעשה מיוט לכולם, לכל המשתתפים.
Yeah.
ואז תשחרר את נעמי.
How do I mute for all? 1 second.
Why don't you just make Dory into a all right. Meeting, and then he'll take care of it.
Right.
Dory, where are you?
He's there.
He's there. I see him.
On the balcony.
Oh, here you are. Okay. So
yeah, just mute everyone, and then when it's time, you can unmute me. Thanks a lot.
There you go. Dory, you got it?
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Thanks, Noah. So I submit that there are sort of greater social and political forces that are in action, and that the academic preoccupation is really just kind of a manifestation of these greater things. And we can talk in our discussion about what are these greater forces. But the fact is that in recent years, we suddenly found anti-vaxxers and even flat earthers holding court in mainstream media. We have a White House which has preferred the notion of alternative facts, which is percolated down into culture. And if we could get on subways or buses, hopefully we will be able to one of these days, then it's not unusual to hear people saying, well,
You might have overdone it.
Now Orin is muted.
okay. When was I muted for this whole time?
You were getting on a bus.
You were getting on a bus, yeah.
I was getting on a bus, and I said that it's not a rare sort of thing to happen when you get on a bus and you hear people, or you're just sitting in a cafe house and people are saying, well, those are your facts, and I have different facts, or saying things like, well, those are facts, but there are other things that are important besides facts, and so on and so forth. So that's a kind of discussion, a kind of conversation which you hear quite often amongst lay people all over the place. And then suddenly COVID hit. And within a minute, virologists became our rock stars. And everyone wanted them in the TV studio. Everyone wanted to hear what they have to say. And it was as if, or there was a feeling for about a second and a half, that, well, now when our backs are to the wall, no one wants their parents to die, no one wants to, die themselves from this virus, we need to listen to the experts. So everyone shut up and let's listen to the experts. And this whole notion of alternative facts was, something that we didn't need to deal with anymore. Made very little sense in the face of such danger. Except that very quickly, and I would submit from the get-go, we began hearing dissenting voices from within the scientific community. And it became clear that there were different models that were being offered by different public health systems and governments. And it also became apparent that politicians will choose the model that best suits their interests from amongst the plethora of models that exist. And so the cry to trust science to some ears gradually began to sound meaningless, or at best naive, since a lot of people started saying to themselves, I'm not talking about academics, but I'm just talking about the general public, and academics too, some of them, there is no one science to listen to. And in fact, the very soul and the very sort of motor of scientific pursuits is disagreement. And when you have a moving target like something like Corona, there's not enough time for us to gain the kind of consensus and clarity that we need in order to act intelligently on scientific data, or even to know which scientific data to follow. And so I guess what I want to do now is first just to thank you, Naomi, for being with us today, and to invite you to begin the conversation by saying, why are the arguments against trusting science? Why are they any weaker for the arguments for trusting science in this day and age?
Great. Okay. Well, Oren, thank you for that terrific introduction. And it's really a pleasure to be with you here. I know it's conventional to say that, but it really is great to see all these wonderful faces, including a number of old friends and beautiful children. So hello, everyone, and Shana Tova, and really happy to be with you. So, Oren, you raised a lot of big questions. So let me just say a few things to try to steer the conversation a little bit. And then I definitely don't want to talk for too long. I know what I think. I don't learn a lot listening to myself. I learn a whole lot more when I listen to other people. So let me just say a couple of things. I want to start today just by emphasizing that it's actually very, very difficult to know what the public think. And this is where we desperately need better, more detailed social scientific research, because people make a lot of assertions about the public. But to the extent that we have data in the United States, and I'm going to focus on the US because that's the place that I know best, and people here may know more about the situation in Israel or other countries, and I really am interested to hear about that. But we have good data in the United States that there is not a general crisis of trust in science. The vast majority of Americans, when asked questions like, do you think science makes our lives better? Do you think that scientists are generally trustworthy? Do you think that science tells us, how the world really is? Those kinds of questions. The vast majority of Americans say yes to those questions. And moreover, we know that the vast majority of Americans think that scientists are more trustworthy than other public authority figures, such as, for example, politicians, or journalists or business leaders. In fact, scientists in the United States come out beat only by military leaders. And there is some interesting data on this from other countries. I saw something that showed that in France, actually the most trusted leaders were regional government, which I thought was fascinating. So I think there's a lot more good social scientific work that we could do about what people really think about science and why they think the things they think. But to the extent that we know about the United States, what we know is that there are specific areas of science where we have problems. It's not a general distrust of science, it's specific. And we know that in the United States, there are 3 specific areas that come up in all public opinion polls. One is climate change, second is vaccine safety, and the third is evolutionary biology. And we even know the reasons why. And the reasons are ideological and political and cultural, and they have to do with people's worldviews. So we know that people who reject evolutionary biology generally do so because they consider it, they're more likely than anything else to be evangelical Christians, evangelical Protestants. They are likely to say that they believe that evolutionary biology clashes with their religious views. And specifically, they would say that they believe that evolutionary biology tells us that life is meaningless. And they don't agree that life is meaningless, and so they reject evolutionary biology. So they're rejecting what they think is an implication of evolutionary biology, the implication that it means that human life is meaningless. And so this is why Eric Conway and I call it implicatory denial. People are rejecting science when they don't like its implications. And so in climate change, which is the area that I've studied most closely, we see that climate science is most likely to be rejected by conservative Republicans who would say that they believe in limited government, low rates of taxation, and they believe that problems are best solved by leaving it to the marketplace, what's sometimes referred to as the magic of the marketplace. And so they resist accepting the reality of climate change because they believe that it will be used to justify bigger government or higher rates of taxes. So they don't like that implication. And this is extremely important to understand, because if you want to address it, you could give these people as much scientific facts as you want. You could have scientists stand up in public and attest to that they're good people, and it would make no difference to these people because it's not addressing the implications. But we actually do have research, and there's some really nice work that has come out of Arizona State University on this. If you sit down with evangelical Christians to talk about evolutionary biology, and you present them with a range of views about the implications of evolutionary biology for the meaning of human existence, including writings by religious scientists such as Sir John Houghton, who's an evangelical, well, he just passed away sadly of COVID, but Sir John Houghton was an evangelical Christian and also an evolutionary biologist, and also a climate scientist. And he wrote extensively about how he reconciled his scientific work with his religious belief. If you can show people that evolutionary biology does not necessarily require you to give up on the meaning of life, this can be effective. So that's just to kind of frame the question. I want to say a little bit about Bruno Latour, because you mentioned him. I think that Bruno gives himself way too much credit or takes too much blame, depending on how you want to view it. The idea that science studies and critical theory is responsible for the crisis of trust in climate science, I think, is ridiculous. We have very little evidence that the ordinary American has been influenced at all by those kinds of arguments. But to the extent that it's part of a broader cultural trend, I don't know, since what, the 1970s perhaps, of questioning authority, of deconstruction in literature and other areas of intellectual life, yeah, sure, it probably played some role for some people. But as I said, the social scientific research that we have, at least in the United States, doesn't support the idea that people who are rejecting climate science are doing so because they read too much Derrida. I mean, there is just no evidence to support that at all. And I think what you said before about larger, broader cultural trends is obviously very important. The other thing I would say is that part of this story, which is crucial, is the political exploitation of distrust in science. And we have seen that massively with COVID-19. We've seen it massively with climate change. My personal view, and this is sort of would be hard to prove historically, but if you go back to say 1988, 89, 1992, to the extent that we had public opinion polling on climate change at that time, the majority of the American people accepted the scientific conclusions that climate change was underway, let's say around 1992, around the time of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And we had broad-based political support for it as well. And as some people will remember, the Republican President George H.W. Bush went to Rio de Janeiro and signed the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. But it's right around that time that we begin to see the political pushback against climate science. And this is what Eric and I documented in Merchants of Doubt. So the whole point of that pushback, and this was the point of our book, was to make people think that the science was unsettled, that we didn't really know for sure, to exploit the disagreement within the scientific community, to exaggerate the uncertainties. And yes, of course, there were uncertainties in climate science, just as there are some uncertainties now in questions about COVID-19. We all know, anyone who studies science knows that science is never 100%, lock it up, throw away the key. There are always legitimate uncertainties, and there are always additional questions that can be asked. And you can always find someone in a scientific community who has a different opinion, and maybe that person will ultimately be vindicated by science. I mean, I have good colleagues who believe that David Bohm will one day be vindicated about quantum mechanics. And I'm sure there are people here who are very familiar with Einstein's objections to the non-determinism of quantum mechanics. But what we saw in the climate change debate, again, no evidence that the average American was actually following the scientific debates about cloud parameterization and that that's why they were skeptical. No, not at all. What we had was an organized political movement, heavily financed by industry, not 100%, but to a great extent, designed to create confusion and doubt and disinformation by exaggerating the degree of scientific disagreement. And what we showed in our book was that they were using the same strategies and tactics as the tobacco industry, that in many cases the same people were involved, often the same public relations firms, the same think tanks. So this was part of a bigger political and sociological structure. And so our argument is that if you want to understand these things, yes, as science studies scholars, we may want to get into the details of scientific debate on these questions, but that's not what's driving that's not what's driving the political activities or the public distrust. And I think we've seen the exact same thing with COVID-19. Yes, to be sure, COVID-19, because it was a new virus, in the early weeks, there were some, significant uncertainties, and there still are. We still don't really know why men, for example, are dying at higher rates than women, except that we know that men are more likely to be stupid and not wear masks. That was in the newspaper today in America. But so obviously there are some real questions, and I don't mean to discount or disparage the genuine scientific uncertainties around COVID-19. But if you go back to January, February, leading health officials in most places, with some exceptions, but certainly here in the United States, had a pretty consistent message about social distancing, hand washing, and the wearing of masks. And moreover, we had warnings about the possible emergence of a novel respiratory illness. There had been a major meeting at Johns Hopkins just a year before in which they had actually predicted almost everything that happened. Well, not the political piece, but they had predicted the possibility of a emergent novel respiratory virus, predicted that it would probably be a zoonotic, and said that we weren't prepared, that we didn't have enough equipment stockpiled, that we didn't have a public health system that was prepared to do the testing and contact tracing that we needed, and also said that even though this particular virus was new, it's not like we've never seen respiratory viruses in the past, and that what we knew about the spread of other respiratory viruses could probably be applied to a novel respiratory virus that might occur in the future. And I think that there was pretty big scientific agreement about that too. But again, what we saw was the exploitation of uncertainty and disagreement for political purposes. And so you have President Trump saying that it's unmanly to wear a mask. I forget who it was just recently, I think it was Mike Huckabee, saying that he wasn't going to be emasculated. So incredibly gender-laden argument about why real men don't wear masks. And we've seen in the United States, again, incredible political polarization, where people who self-identify as liberals, progressives, and Democrats are all staying home, washing their hands, and wearing masks. People who self-identify as Republicans or conservatives, much less willing to accept the public health advice. So yes, there are some scientific uncertainties, and I don't mean to minimize them, but I don't think that's what drives the social and political debate over the issue. That's probably a good place to stop. I could say a few words about the new book if people want, or we could just go straight into the discussion.
Well,
Anada's nodding her head about the new book. Okay, all right, let me say a few words about the new book then. Okay, so I wanted to say something about why I wrote this book, because some of my friends were surprised that I was writing a book about trusting science, because in a way it's an odd title for someone in science studies, given that so much of our work is about questioning science, questioning scientific methods, questioning the cultural authority of science, trying to understand why science does or doesn't have authority in different situations. So the book really came out of a very specific experience that I had as a public intellectual. So after Merchants of Doubt was published, actually even before, I was giving a lot of public lectures on climate science, on the history of climate science. And part of what I was doing in these lectures was to try to refute two pieces of misinformation that were very common in the United States. One piece of misinformation was the claim that there was no consensus among scientists. And this is something that had been repeated at the highest possible levels. George W. Bush had said it, Dick Cheney had said it, Republican leaders in the Senate had said it, you know, business leaders. No consensus was a kind of mantra of the right wing in America. And I knew that that was false because I had written this article in 2004 in which I actually analyzed the scientific literature, and also because I live and breathe in the scientific community. And it was very clear to me that there was really essentially no scientific agreement among working scientists about the basic facts that climate change was underway and being driven primarily by greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuels and deforestation, and also agriculture and land use change. There's really no disagreement about that in the scientific meetings. And I was attending scientific conferences regularly on these questions. So part of what I wanted to do was to explain, well, how did scientists come to this consensus? What is the evidence? And so I had this very carefully constructed lecture that began with, you know, John Tyndall in Ireland in the 1850s. And I had a kind of joke, you know, if this is a hoax, it started in Ireland 150 years ago, you know, to sort of just show the intrinsic implausibility of the claim that this was some kind of liberal hoax, or this was some kind of liberal conspiracy. Because that was the other thing. Senate Republicans had said climate change was a liberal conspiracy to bring down global capitalism, to which I always responded that scientists should be so organized. You know. So anyway, so the whole point was to show that this was scientific work that had been carried on for more than 100 years, to explain the science, to explain what kind of evidence scientists use, and to sort of bring the audience to a place where they would understand, oh yes, this is real, this isn't a liberal conspiracy, and we could argue about what to do about it, right? We could have differences of opinion about what the appropriate policy response is. We could even argue if we even needed to respond, right? We could have an informed debate about how serious the consequences were or were not, but you couldn't really debate that this science had been done. And so I would give these talks, and very often at the end of the talk, there'd be someone in the audience. I have to say, again, not being prejudiced, just this is as an empirical observation, it was almost always a man, typically a white man over 50, and typically kind of belligerent. The guy would stand up, you know, put his hands on his hips and stick out his chest and kind of aggressive and say, well, that's all very well and good, but why should we trust the science? And I started thinking, yeah, you know, it's a fair question, right? Even if the motivation is hostile, even if the tone of the questioner is belligerent, the question of why we should assume that scientists, even if they've worked really hard and they've worked on this for 150 years, why should we assume that they've come to the correct conclusion? And the more I spoke in public, the more I realized that most of us in science studies actually didn't have a good answer to that question. We didn't have a simple answer. And if you asked people in the public who did trust science, why did they trust science? Because I would sometimes throw my questions back to my audience or ask my students this, I would often get answers that as a science studies scholar, I considered to be wrong. So sometimes the answer you would get was essentially the great man theory of science. It was that we should trust science because scientists are geniuses, right? And I even had one person who once told me he didn't believe in climate science because I, the historian of science, could not identify the one genius, the one person, the Newton or the Einstein or the Copernicus or the Galileo who had, quote, discovered climate change. So this very, very great man, genius epistemology of science turns out to be still very, very prevalent among people. I also found that others who were not necessarily subscribing to the great man thesis were subscribing to the hypothetical deductive model of science. That is to say, believing that science is true by virtue of the use of the scientific method. And most people, if you ask them, well, what do you mean by the scientific method? Generally, they really had no answer. You know, they just had this vague idea there was this thing they learned in school called the scientific method. But if they had some idea, it was like, well, scientists have hypotheses, you know, they do experiments to test them and then they see if it's true. So it was some sort of the HD model. And I thought, wow, this is really terrible. You know, this is just like an incredible mess. And it shows that all this good work we've done in science studies, history of science, philosophy of science, it's really not penetrated to the general population, or at least not the populations of people that I was speaking with. And so I got invited a few years ago to do the Tanner Lectures at Princeton, and I thought, this is what I want to talk about. I want to see, and for those of you who maybe aren't familiar, Tanner Lectures are pretty prestigious. You get paid a very nice honorarium. You give typically 1, 2, or 3 lectures, and they're intended to be focused or targeted at a general educated audience. So the idea is that if you go to a university, you would give a talk that anyone at the university, students and faculty in a variety of departments, fields, could come to, or members of the community could come to and understand. So I set myself the challenge of trying to answer that question. How could we use history and philosophy of science and science studies to give a principled and defensible answer for why scientific results are likely to be trustworthy? And so that was a pretty tall task to set for myself. And I know there's a lot of things in the book that I don't talk about. And if I'd been writing a more scholarly book or wanted it to be longer or was willing for it to be longer, I could have addressed a lot more things. But essentially, what the book argues is a social epistemology standpoint, that it's not the case that scientific results are correct because scientists are geniuses. They may or may not be. We certainly know plenty who aren't, right? Nor is it the case that it's always right because they use the hypothetical deductive model, because A, we know lots of scientists don't use the hypothetical deductive model, and B, even if they do, we know it doesn't guarantee accurate results. But if we take seriously the insights of social epistemology and the idea that diverse communities of scientists looking at problems from many different angles and being open to critical interrogation, being open to criticism, and being willing to use that criticism to revise and improve their views, we have, I think, good reason to think that that methodology is shared across many disciplines and does give us reason to think that scientific results are ceteris paribus likely to be reliable. That though, so I'll just say one more thing and then I'll stop. But that of course leaves us with what I often think of as kind of the big question in history of science. We have these conspicuous examples of scientists saying things in the past that we look back now and we say, no, those were not right. And so what do we do about that? And so the second chapter in the book looks at a set of examples where in hindsight, we would say scientists did not get it right. And the samples that I used are not scientific. Like I didn't have some scientific mechanism for deciding what the examples should be. I just chose a set of examples that I knew something about, that I thought fit the criteria of a claim that in hindsight we would say was wrong, that I thought I knew enough about historically to feel confident that I could talk about them in a way that wouldn't be just sort of potted history. And that I thought maybe could help us differentiate between science that we think is likely to hold up versus science that we might be suspicious of. And so it's a fairly complicated chapter, but one of the key things I argue then builds on my earlier work, which is about consensus. And one of the arguments I make is that if you go back and look closely at some of these cases where people have claimed that there was a scientific consensus that X, but now we think Y, actually what you find in those cases is there wasn't a consensus. And by that, I don't mean just that there was one guy who disagreed, like David Bohm, for example, but actually that there was a pretty vigorous disagreement or dissent even at the time. And so I went back to my own work on continental drift and pointed out something that I think I did say at the time in my first book, but I probably didn't say strongly enough or didn't emphasize enough, that in my book, I emphasized very strongly that Americans had rejected continental drift. And that's the subtitle of the book, Theory and Method in American Science. But what I probably didn't stress enough is that many Europeans did accept it. So that is to say, there was a consensus against the theory in the United States, but there was not a consensus against the theory in the scientific community as a whole, as it was operating at that time. And so this should be a bit of a flag to us that if there's robust disagreement within the scientific community, including communities of experts, perhaps in a different country or looking at the problem from a different angle, that is something about which we need to be concerned. And so in a way that brings us full circle because again, this is where we as science studies scholars or historians or philosophers of science have a role to play that I think is almost unique, which is that actually we are in the position of differentiating between what we could call genuine disagreement in the scientific community versus political exploitation of disagreement or public confusion or, you know, talk radio or whatever it is. And so that's one of the major arguments of the book, that consensus is really important, but we need to be careful. If we say there isn't a consensus, we have to be clear what we're talking about. Are we talking about a political consensus, a social consensus, a cultural consensus, or an expert consensus? Because these are quite different things. And I would say that in the case of climate science, there is no question that we have an expert consensus, but we may or may not have a political and cultural consensus. So let me stop there. I think that's probably enough material, and I'm anxious to hear what people have to say.
For sure. So you spoke about a lot of issues. Maybe we should start with questions under the rubric of the criticism that you're minimizing the lack of consensus in scientific debates. Because, as you said, your historical chapter, you know, you chose a number of issues that you knew something about, and so it wasn't a potted history from your point of view, and it was responsible in that sense. But, you know, if you went searching, you could probably find a number of good examples of things that were quite consensual for a very long time, but then were completely overturned. And we all learn about this in History of Science 101, the ether, the epicycles, whatever, the number of teeth in a female's mouth, going back to Aristotle. So if there are any questions from the audience, more specifically about that criticism of the argument that Naomi is making, is Naomi minimizing the lack of consensus in scientific debates in order to make the larger claim? Is anyone want to, anything under that general?
I would like, not a question, but to make a comment, which I do believe that minimizing this consensus is something which I see as a very positive approach. The ability to stay in minority, even though the majority of whatever community, social expert thinks the different, and you insist. Some cases, for the long term, you may be proven to be right, even if it will take another century. So, and making this consensus something holy is something I would stay away from, which I truly believe is, I think the same as Naomi.
I also have a question. I'm in my background, I'm a scientist in the chromatin field. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. And I was just thinking, as Owen was speaking now, of the consensus about the importance of genetic influence, or the genetic code, rather than the epigenetic influences in code. And that definitely is a very strong example of how consensus was misleading and really leading for policies and medical decisions that we now understand more and more were wrong. So I'm not sure, and particularly as a scientist in my own experience, I don't know that I, without just by my own personal experience, agree that the matter of consensus should be taken so strongly as you suggest.
Yeah, well, let me respond here. So first of all, I just want to say, I think in the book, I do try to make it clear that I'm not making consensus to be holy. And as I said, I mean, my first book was all about a consensus that in hindsight, we would say was wrong, which is partly why I thought I was actually a good person to take on this issue, because in a sense, I had to address the possible argument that I was contradicting myself, right? Now, I don't think that I am, because I think that, as I said, I was looking at why a particular community of scientists rejected something that we would now say was true. And I think I was able to demonstrate fairly compellingly that cultural, philosophical, and epistemological commitments affected how they viewed the science in a way that was quite different from how Europeans viewed the exact same claims. And so I think it's a strong argument, therefore, the importance of cultural setting and understanding how we look at science, and therefore also being sensitive to the fact that people looking at something from a different cultural setting may have a different perspective, and that perspective might be right. So one of the other arguments that comes out of the book then, and which is building on the social epistemology perspective, is the extreme importance of diversity in science. And that if we have a reason to believe that a scientific community is not diverse, and by diverse, I don't just mean demographically diverse, but also epistemologically diverse, that scientists need to be looking at things with different methods, different approaches. This is extremely important. And so this is one of the, I guess we could say, possible remedies. I don't know if remedy is quite the right word. That sounds too formulaic. But one of the things that we need to be mindful about is the community diverse? Are they really looking at the problem from a number of different angles? Because if they're not, then we might have reason to say, look, we should not jump to conclusions about this. We really do need to do more work on this, and we need to look at it from some different angles. And I mean, this comes up very clearly in biomedicine with the whole issue of RCTs, randomized clinical trials. And Nancy Cartwright has written very, very eloquently on this. There's a kind of fetishization of RCTs among some people in the scientific community. That, in my opinion, is clearly unhelpful. And we've seen it even in this argument over masks, because there was some legitimate disagreement about masks, particularly in the United Kingdom. There's been some public discussion of this. There were a group of scientists, high-level scientists in the United Kingdom, who did not think that they could recommend wearing masks because they didn't have RCT data. There wasn't a good randomized controlled clinical trial. Now, I think that is idiotic, right? Because there can be many situations, and Nancy and others have written about this, there are many things for which you cannot do RCTs because they would be unethical or they're just impractical, or other situations where, yes, probably in the fullness of time, you would like to try to do an RCT, and people are actually trying to figure out now how you could do an ethical RCT of masks. But sometimes, for whatever reason, you don't have an RCT, but you have other data and you have other reason to believe that something is true from animal studies or from mechanistic arguments. And the idea that you would ignore what you know from animal studies or mechanistic arguments or past experience with other pandemics because you don't have an RCT now, to me, that's what I call methodological fetishism. And I think it's very, very damaging. So the diversity from a methodological as well as a demographic standpoint is clearly very, very important. The other thing, of course, to say about all of this is that, Tom, is that your name? Yeah, so Tom just said, well, we were wrong about that and now we're right. But of course, if we take these arguments seriously, we can't say that either. We can't say we're right now, right? All we can say is we think we're onto something better now. And so that's where then this whole thing begins to have bite, because Oren is, of course, absolutely true that there are things in the history of science that we would say in hindsight, okay, yeah, like nobody now, as far as I know, believes there's an ether, right? So there are some things that, although, we would say as historians, we'd have to say, but, can't rule out 100%. But here's the thing. Let's say we had to make a public policy decision where people's life, their health, their property, their communities were at stake. Are we going to make that public policy decision on the assumption there is an ether or on the assumption that there isn't? And I think that's where then this argument becomes very, very clear in its implications for public policy. When we have to make choices now, and we can't afford to wait another 100 years or 200 years, to see if the ether is brought back or if determinism is brought back in quantum science, we have to make a decision now. And what are we going to make that decision about? And then if it's a question that involves scientific knowledge, that's where the consensus of experts kicks in. We have to make a choice. We know that that consensus may be wrong. We do know that, and we're not denying that. I would never deny that in public or in private, but we have to make some choices. And we have good reason to believe in the case of climate change that if we continue on this present track, well, people have been hurt already and many more people will be hurt, and the people who will be hurt will be the most vulnerable. So, and this is where I worked with the Pope, right? So on both scientific and ethical grounds, we have reason to say that we need to act on climate science. And of course, that's the other issue. I'm never saying, I never would say that climate science is determinative. And I don't like it, and I sometimes correct colleagues when they say the science tells us that we have to do X. I think that's a formulation that no one in science studies could ever agree with. What the science tells us is that if we do X, we have the likelihood of outcome Y, and if we don't do X, we have the outcome of likelihood Z. And then we can make the case for why outcome Z is a bad one, because in the case of climate change, we're talking about 35 million people in the Bay of Bengal who will be displaced by climate change, trillions of dollars in property damage that has already occurred, massive loss of life in communities from wildfires, typhoons and hurricanes have been made worse. I mean, the list goes on and on and on, and most of you are probably familiar with it. So we have very, very strong evidence that climate change has already caused death and destruction on the planet, huge losses of biodiversity, and that these will accelerate as we go forward. So there's both an ethical and a scientific argument, but I do think it's important also to be clear about the science doesn't tell us we have to do X. It tells us if we don't do X, people get hurt.
I know Ravit has a question on scientific methodology. Ravit, you here?
Yeah. I was wondering, given the kind of intellectual chaos that we're in and trying to find what's actually true, if you think there are any alternatives to current methodologies of science that would maybe reduce the bias and help gain like more definitive answers. And I guess the other question is from a social perspective as well, if there is something that, you know, kind of the way to be more reflective to the public.
Okay, let me just ask you, when you say reduce the bias, I'm not sure what you mean by that. Could you clarify what you mean by reduce the bias?
I think that an example that you gave earlier, that the minority may actually be right, but still at the time they're considered not the most popular opinion, and yet they might be. So if you think there are any certain mechanisms or methodologies that could work better.
Yeah, okay, that's a great question. Thank you for that.
Oh, sorry, I just realized I was with no camera.
Oh, it's okay, I could hear you, which is the more important piece. So it's nice to see your face as well. Okay, so this raises a very interesting question. And as Oren said, I've written a lot of books. The last few years have been very productive since my children grew up. So some of you know I co-authored a book with a group of colleagues called Discerning Experts. It's co-authored with Dale Jamieson, a philosopher of science who some of you probably know, Michael Oppenheimer, who's a very prominent climate scientist, and then we had a terrific team of postdocs involved as well, including Matt Schindel, who's now at the Smithsonian, and Jesse O'Reilly, who now teaches in Indiana. So we have this very great team, and one of the things we looked at, well, the book is about how do experts decide when they're asked to render a decision about a complicated question like climate change or the ozone hole. How do they actually do that? What does that process look like? And so we did a combination of oral history, reviewing documentary evidence, and also participant observation to get at this question. One of the things we found, so one of the venues that we looked at was the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And Michael Oppenheimer, my co-author, has been involved as an insider in IPCC for a long time. So one of the things we found that the IPCC does is that they actually have rules that when they put together a group of experts to write a chapter for an IPCC report, they have a requirement that those authors have to be diverse. And they define diversity primarily in terms of geographic diversity, which is to say they can't all be from North America and Europe. They have to include people from the global South, from poorer countries, and they even have to make efforts to try to support scholars, colleagues who are coming from a poorer country that might have a weaker scientific infrastructure. So have people from African countries, you know, from island nations, this sort of thing. So we found that to be a very interesting observation because we thought it meant that implicitly they're actually taking a kind of social epistemology approach, and they're implicitly accepting that people from different countries may have different perspectives that need to be heard. But then, the question that leads to, though, is, are they actually heard? And what does it really mean? What would it really look like to to enact that in a serious way, not to just have it as window dressing. And so we actually, and we spoke to a few people in the IPCC who were from the Global South, who did feel that this was a problem, who felt like they were in the room physically, but that their concerns, their ideas were not necessarily taken as seriously. And part of the problem was that scientists often judge each other by their internal standards of expertise, which include things like how many articles have you written and how many citations do you have your articles received. And if you come from a country with a weak scientific infrastructure, well, it's harder to publish, and it's harder to publish in high visibility places, and it's harder to attend the scientific conferences that would enable other people to know about your work and know that they should cite it. Because here's another interesting sociological fact that maybe some of you know, but I only learned this recently myself. The single greatest predictor of whether a paper gets cited is how many authors there are. The more authors, the more citations. And if you think about it sociologically, it's not actually shocking when you realize it, because we all tend to cite people we already know. So the more authors they are, the more people they know, the more they get cited. So this greatly disadvantages someone who comes from, say, a Pacific Island nation, for example. So what could be done about that? So we actually proposed to the IPCC that we wanted to do a second stage of the project in which we would do participant observation in the meetings to actually observe the dynamics and also to do more detailed interviews with people to try to really get at that question. And the IPCC would not let us. So that's a bit of a heartbreak to me. And I also think it's incredibly stupid on their part, because I think that, I think that by not being transparent about these things, they contribute to the idea that they have something to hide. And I think that they should have known that we are basically sympathetic to the project, that we wouldn't be involved in some kind of muckraking activity. And so we wrote a very detailed proposal. We explained how we would respect the confidentiality. We explained how people in our field, social scientists, have protocols for doing this, how we'd already done something similar with the US National Academy of Sciences, and that they had accepted it, and we couldn't get the IPCC to agree to it. So that was very heartbreaking to me. And personally, I'm tired and I'm getting old, so I don't have the strength to kind of fight with them about this, but I would really encourage other scholars to think about, I think this is a really important research area, and to think about maybe trying again with the IPCC, or if they won't allow it, think about other, other UN organizations or other organizations in your own country where you might be able to observe this, because I do think it's really, really important. So that was that was a long answer to the bias question, but I think it's really important. And I can't read my own handwriting. You said something about getting more definitive answers, I think. Can you rephrase what the second part of the question was?
Well, you answered that.
Oh, okay.
It's pretty much part of the same. Thank you very much. It's fascinating.
You're welcome.
Ophir, any questions?
I have a question I wanted to ask. Oh, sorry.
No.
Go ahead. Go ahead, please.
Naomi, first of all, thank you very much. It was fascinating to listen to you. And I wanted to ask you a question that deals with the reactions of the scientific community to scientists who the scientific community might feel were influenced. What you wrote about in your book, let's say, a small group of scientists that had so much impact on very big political decisions and historical decisions. So what is the reaction or the proper reaction from the scientific community if they think there was, something at play, something, they think scientists were bought off by tobacco companies and something wrong happened? So first of all, what's the proper way for the scientific community to react in order to prevent future cases like that? And another question would be, how can that be made public? So how can people know, oh, I shouldn't take this scientist seriously because he has a certain track record that's really problematic. He's been bought off by these companies in the past, just like a juror or, in law, I assume someone's record should be brought forth before they give an expert opinion.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. So the first part about it, how should scientists react? One of the things that we found when we were writing Merchants of Doubt is that the vast majority of the scientific community just ignored it. They just thought, it's bogus, it's rubbish, we won't dignify it with a response. And I even did an interview with a very prominent scientist who I really respected, who was in a position to have said something about what the Merchants of Doubt were doing. He knew them well, he was aware of it, he understood why their arguments were fallacious, and he knew that they were linked to the tobacco industry. And so over lunch once at the faculty club at UCSD, I said to him, you know, why didn't you say something? And he said, well, we knew it was garbage, so, you know, we just ignored it. And I think that's the impulse of a lot of scientists, is just to say, you know, someone says something stupid, you just ignore it. And I have to say in my own life, I've seen this a lot. And when I was an undergraduate or a graduate student, I didn't understand it. I used to get very outraged when I'd be at a conference or something and somebody would say something idiotic and nobody would take it on. And then I realized, oh yeah, well, you know, up to a point it's right. Up to a point you pick your battles. You don't have to correct every mistake that every person makes, you know. Or maybe you're thinking, well, I know something about that issue, but you know, someone else knows more about it, so I'll let them deal with it. So, I mean, there are good reasons why you don't necessarily want to get in a fight every time anyone says something stupid, foolish, erroneous, whatever it is, right? But I do think that when there's a kind of big deception or a big piece of misinformation that is being promoted by a person who's in a position of authority, I do think scientists have to stand up against it. Because a lot of what, say, someone like Bill Nierenberg said, you know, got repeated in the press and people read it, and a lot of people thought it was right because no one in the scientific community corrected it. So I do think scientists have an obligation to try to find ways to correct things, particularly if they have reason to believe that it's deliberate misinformation or disinformation. But how do you do that? And that's where it's really, really tricky. And that's where the Merchants of Doubt are, in my opinion, clever to the point of being evil. I'll use that word. Because the whole strategy, and this is why the book has the title Merchants of Doubt, and this is in their own writings, right? The whole strategy is to create doubt, to create the impression that there's a debate, to create the impression that there's no consensus. So if scientist A comes along and says, well, you know, I don't believe that because X, Y, Z, and then I stand up in public, I say, oh, no, but you should believe it because Q, R, S, and T. Well, look, now we've got a public debate and I've lost and they've won. So it's incredibly difficult. So you can't just say, oh, you're wrong and here's the evidence why. You actually have to expose it as disinformation. You have to say, this is disinformation, and let me explain why it's disinformation. And that's, of course, what we did in the book, but it took 2 people, 5 years, 350 pages. You know, it was a tremendous amount of work to do that. And of course, if you're trying to do your science at the same time, then you don't actually have the time and the space and the strength to do that. And you know, one of the things that was interesting to me that I learned while we were writing Merchants of Doubt is that there were other people who knew what was going on. There were other scientists who had been victims of attacks who were aware that these guys were spreading disinformation. They weren't necessarily aware that they'd worked for tobacco, but they were in some cases aware that, say, the people who were attacking climate scientists had also previously attacked the ozone scientists. And I actually asked one of the scientists who I knew well and respected, I said, well, why didn't you say something about it? And he said, well, I just wanted to do my science. You know, he's a scientist, he wants to do his science. He's not going to take 5 years out of his life to write a history book, and he's not a historian anyway. So I think that what happened with Eric and I writing that book was that because we were historians, we could write that book and tell that book as historians, and we could view it as part of our job to do that work in a way that most scientists couldn't. Now, that said, it was a big decision on both of our parts because Eric did it all like nights and weekends. And for 5 years, Eric had like almost no life because, you know, his day job was being the historian of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, writing on the history of rocketry and Mars exploration. And at night, he's writing Merchants of Doubt. I was a little luckier because of the nature of my job. I could work on Merchants of Doubt as my my primary preoccupation for 5 years, but I did put aside work that was actually supposed to be my full professor book, the sort of serious scholarly history of science, which was the book on oceanography, which, as Oren said, is now finally coming out 10 years later. So it all worked out because my colleagues accepted Merchants of Doubt as a legitimate piece of scholarship, and I was in fact promoted to full professor on the basis of that book, not the book that I had intended to write. So I was pretty lucky because it could have gone a different way, right? I could be one of those people who's still languishing in the ranks of associate professordom, still underpaid and all that, because my colleagues would say, well, that's all very well and good, but this is a popular book and you still have to write your oceanography book. And then I'd be like one of those bitter academics who's finally being promoted to full professor just about when she's ready to retire, you know? So there are real risks involved in doing this kind of work. And I'm super grateful that it worked out for me, not just for me, but also because I think now it becomes a model that shows, yes, you can do this kind of work, and it is scholarship and it is historical. And so long as you have, you know, good footnotes, your colleagues can recognize this as scholarly work. But there was definitely, you know, there were definitely times that Eric and I, well, like I said, Eric just gave up his nights and weekends, so he wasn't too worried about his day job. The great news about Eric, though, is that although he had no life for 5 years, then a woman at JPL read the book, and that woman is now his wife. So it all worked out.
I have a question.
Yes.
Hello. Do you think, Naomi, that there is a role for the state, for the government, somehow to protect science against being biased or abused? So it will still serve the interest of the nation or maybe humanity and not being taken to places where we don't want to be? Or you believe it should be totally sterilized and there should be a divorce between the wilderness of the state and the paradise of science?
Yeah, well, when you put it that way, then clearly no. Yeah, another good complicated question. So clearly science is involved with the state. It has been involved with states for a long, long time. I mean, we know that Galileo, you know, studied ballistics. And of course, you know, if you think about, say, early astronomy and astrology that my good colleague Bob Westman worked on for so long, I mean, it's involved in the forms of state that exist at that time, you know, being patronized by princes and things like this. So I don't think the idea that science could or should be separated from the state is a historically realistic one. But we do have to think through what that relationship should look like. And right now in the United States, the state represents a threat to science. I mean, we're looking at pretty severe intimidation of science, gag rules against scientists working in the federal government, yeah, all kinds of suppression of scientific data and information. So I think in the United States, one of the questions we're facing is how do we repair the damage of recent years? And I think a lot of scientists were fairly naive about this question because there was a period after World War II where scientists worked closely with the state in a way that most people felt was very productive. And the new oceanography book deals with this. So people had a kind of very positive image of what the science-state relationship looked like and how it was a win-win situation that was good for both. In the oceanography book, I argue that that view is too idealistic, that well before Donald Trump, there were a lot of tensions involved in the relationship between the scientists and the state. And obviously here I draw on a lot of existing work in history of science and science studies, but I look in close detail at some specific examples. And I guess where I come down, and I don't know that I don't think I actually say this in the book, but I think this is where I'm coming to. I think what I think about that relationship parallels my arguments about diversity in science. I think it's pretty risky for scientists to rely too much on any one source of patronage. And that in the United States, in the period of, say, 50 years after the end of World War II, American scientists really came to depend almost entirely on the US federal government for support, not 100%, but very dominantly. And now we're seeing some of the risks of that excessive reliance unfolding And, you know, when Donald Trump was elected president and he threatened to cut all kinds of funding for science, there was a big group of scientists in America who started talking about, well, could we get more private philanthropy? Could we get the Gates Foundation? Could we get some of these billionaires like Mark Zuckerberg to fund science? And when you look at the amount of money involved, you realize that even if the richest men and women in the world were prepared to take this on, it's not clear they actually could afford it. I mean, the scale on which science operates is so large that in most countries, it almost has to be a state function. So I think it's a really difficult issue. And again, a lot of good things that we all could be working on.
May I ask a follow-up question?
Just a question about funding, state funding.
Sure.
Can I go on? It's okay. You talked about diversity and about federal funding, and one of the big, I think, differences between developed countries and underdeveloped countries or other parts of the world outside Europe and North America is the ability to fund this kind of the resources and ability to find science, and what solution can you see to this kind of dilemma or problem? You know, Latin American or Asia, or I don't know about Asian, but African and Latin American countries can never have the resources European and North American science has.
Yeah, that's a great.
You talked about the importance of diversity. So.
Yeah, that's a great question. So that's not something I've thought a lot about. I probably should think about it more, but certainly I think that there is a strong argument for thinking about means to build scientific infrastructure in poorer countries. And, you know, you think about the Gates Foundation and all the work they've put into malaria prevention and vaccination in Africa. And that's good. I'm not opposed to that. But, you know, probably it would do those countries better in the long run if what Gates would do would be to actually fund the development of, homegrown science in those countries. So that's a short answer, which I'm usually bad at. So I'll just stop on that one so I can have at least one short answer to a question.
Thanks.
There are questions. Noam wants to ask a question, and Ophir and Tzipi. So Noam, why don't you go ahead?
Okay. Thank you. It was a fascinating talk. And I have a simple question. Is there today a responsible way not to trust science, to suspect science, or to suspend our automatic trust in science? And I ask it because the way the question of trust is framed today seems to leave no more space for such a possibility. We see it not only in your talk, in the general public discourse.
Yeah.
The question of trust is drawn into this abhorring process of polarization. It's one more theme in this abhorring process of political polarization. And when it is framed like this, it's like a gun is pointed at our head. You have to choose. Trust, align yourself either with science or with Trump. When the question is framed in that way, we have no choice, of course, but trust science. But what gets lost is the possibility of a healthy suspicion in science. And my question is there any more space for such a healthy suspicion? And furthermore, maybe it is this space of suspicions that we should nurture today. Because if you look at the way polarization takes effect in every field, there's no way out of it by aligning yourself with with a good camp.
Yeah. This is a very important question, and I agree with you completely. And I definitely would not want anyone to think that I am saying, we have to line up behind science and wave the banner of science, and science is always right, and everything else is suspicion and superstition and myth and all those things. I mean, that is not at all what I would want to be interpreted to be saying. I think that this is a case where our academic resources can serve us very well. So I don't think any of us are ever want to be in the position of saying science is always right and anyone who rejects science is a troglodyte. No, that's not what we're saying. But what we can say is that actually scholarly apparatus can help us sort out the the question of when we can think that science is likely to be reliable and when maybe it's not, when we could have some healthy skepticism. And here I would draw on two things. One would be traditional philosophy of science. And I think somewhere in the book I say something along these lines. There are some basic questions that come out of traditional philosophy of science that we can ask. So obvious question number one, well, what is the evidence for this claim? How robust is the evidence? How large are the sample sizes? How methodologically, what were the methods that were used for this? And do we have evidence from different methodological approaches? So I used the example of the RCT earlier today. RCTs are great when you have them, but you might want to also have animal studies. I mean, very interestingly, I was involved in something recently where the food industry in the United States is trying to discredit evidence that a plant-based diet is healthier than a diet that has a lot of red meat and processed meats. And the food industry is now trying to discredit animal studies. And this is a very shocking thing to me, but in a way not at all surprising when you start to think about it, because one of the difficulties of nutrition is that it's very, very difficult to do RCTs, and it's impossible to do blinded trials because people know what they eat, and people also lie about what they eat. So very difficult to know for sure what any person has actually eaten and what its effect on health is. But animal studies can be very effective complements because, we can show that if you feed rats a diet that is filled with processed meats, they develop all kinds of cancers. So the food industry wants to discredit animal studies, and they're trying to make common cause with animal rights activists. So here's what I think. I think animal studies are very, very important. And I think that even though there are ethical concerns, I think we should be very, very cautious about saying that animal studies should be ruled out completely. So methodological diversity, evidence, the old-fashioned notion of consilience of evidence, having evidence from a lot of different sources, all of these traditional philosophical values, I think, are extremely important. Replication, reproducibility, those values, I think, are still valid and important for us to be prepared to discuss and invoke. And if we think there's a scientific claim that we think is questionable because it's not methodologically robust, or the sample size was very small, or there's only one line of evidence that's not supported by independent evidence, those are all potentially reasonable grounds for skepticism. But lest I sound like an old-fashioned 1920s logical empiricist, I think we can also bring in the social epistemological perspective as well. And again, this is where the diversity issue comes in. We can also ask the question, well, what does the scientific community itself look like? And again, scientists get very nervous about that because they can say it feels ad hominem, it can feel like character assassination. And to be sure, climate scientists have been victims of a lot of character assassination, but it's not character assassination to ask about the community as a whole. And if you can show that this community is very lopsided, if it's all, white men from rich countries, and there's reason to believe that the perspectives of people from the global south or island nations are relevant but have not been heard, then these are questions that we can raise. So there absolutely is a way to, I think, to have healthy skepticism. And I think the right way to do it is to invoke certain principles that have been pretty well established in the scholarly literature that we can then cite and say, look, we have reason to believe that if we don't have methodological diversity, that could be a problem.
Ophir and Tzipi, and then Itamar, in that order.
Hi, Naomi.
Hi.
So Oren mentioned the variety of historical case studies in gaining consensus. And you were speaking about the obligation of scientists to reject too dangerous kind of claims. And that brings me to ask you about the historical dispute between Alison Winter and Robert Darnton about the practice of hypnosis in the mid-19th century in Europe, especially Britain and France. So in your own research about climate change and the continental drift, do you think more like Darnton, that pseudoscience is separate from science and eventually truth will prevail? Or more like Alison Winter, who thinks that a conflict between pseudoscience and science is inherent to the scientific inquiry, and therefore it shapes the future of science?
I'm sorry, what was the last thing? And therefore what?
it shapes the future of science, meaning it's changing science.
Right. Yeah. Well, this is, of course, a very big, very famous, and very difficult debate in a period that I'm not expert. But I think this is like almost all debates, they're both partly right and they're both partly wrong. Or we could say they're both right in what they affirm and wrong in what they deny. So, Alison Winter is, I think, absolutely right. I think almost any historian of science would want to agree with her that conflict is inherent in science. And in fact, I would go further. I would say it's good, right? If you take seriously, say, the Helen Longino arguments about critical interrogation, we have to expect that there will be conflict in science. We have to embrace that. We have to see it as essentially a positive thing because it's part of that process of critical interrogation. And if we didn't see some friction, some intellectual friction, then we might actually want to be suspicious that something seems a bit odd. So I definitely think intellectual friction is inherent in science. And I think that many of us understand that friction as being part of a critical process that we hope in time, if it's evidence-based, does yield reliable representations of the natural world. Now, you use the expression "truth will prevail." I can't remember, does Darden use that phrase in his book and his argument? No, you're just saying that's your casting of it. So, this is the point. We don't know, right? We don't ever have any way of knowing. We can't stand outside science and say, okay, we finally have truth now and it's all good, right? I mean, this is what philosophers have been concerned about kind of forever, right? All we can really say is that, well, we can say that we have reasons to believe that the representations that science settle on are reliable, and we can point to successes in the history of science where we think that has occurred. But even then, now we're going to get into some pretty difficult epistemological territory, right? Because, what does it mean to say that something is a reliable representation, right? Well, obviously there's a huge literature on this question, but I guess I tend to be sympathetic to the arguments of David Bloor and others who have viewed scientific theories as fundamentally instrumental. So in his Enigma of the Aerofoil, David Bloor gives a rather nice summation, I think, of a longstanding argument about the instrumentalism of scientific theories. And he says that essentially we judge theories by how well they work for our purposes. And if our purposes change, we may feel we need other theories to achieve other things. And that doesn't mean that the theory was right or wrong. It doesn't make the theory wrong. It makes the theory different because we now have a different goal. And he makes an analogy, which I think a lot of traditional historians of science would probably resist, but I actually am sympathetic to, which is to say that, a scientific theory is like an airplane, right? And that's not something that, say, most historians of science in the 50s or 60s would have agreed with, but I think it's kind of right. So basically his argument is, if we were to ask the question, what is the best airplane? He says, well, that's not actually a very meaningful question, because what do we mean by best? Do we mean the plane that flies the fastest? Do we mean the one that's most fuel efficient, so we can fly it on a regular route from New York to Tel Aviv and have a low cost? Do we mean the safest one, that our first job is the safety of the passengers in the airplane? If it's a military jet, then it's maybe the precision at which it can be navigated. So best is going to depend upon what we're using it for. And he wants to argue that that's the same for scientific theories too. So depending on what our intellectual goals are, different theories will be best. I think that that's a highly defensible position. Now, it could also be viewed as evasive because it's evading the issue of truth. And obviously, many of us do evade the issue of truth because we know it can't actually be solved. That said, I do think that there are times that it's appropriate, particularly when we're talking to general audiences, of not being afraid to talk about the truth, because I think that if we don't talk about the truth in certain contexts, it does feel evasive, and I think people pick up on that. So I have an article that I wrote recently with my graduate student, Eric Baker, in which I do argue that people in science studies should feel willing to use the truth and not feel like they have to always put truth in scare quotes. But that's in a very specific context that has to do with public communication. In my private life, I still would prefer to talk about reliable representations.
Okay, Okay, thank you. I'd like to get this article.
I'm sorry, what?
I'd like to get this article.
Oh, of course, yeah. I think Oren probably has it, but if he doesn't, I can send him a PDF to share. I think it's open access anyway. It's social epistemology, which I believe everything is open access, but I can check on that. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome.
Ipi?
Hi. Thank you for your talk. It was really fascinating. There's a debate, I think, around from 2005 in sociology, which is, I think, really similar to your debate that you're trying to make about public sociology. And Bourdieu in 2005 published a book about sociologists and why people don't listen to them. And some of the things, and Boy talked about in 2012, and I think it relates to my question, which I put there in the chat. What prevents us as lay people to trust science? And I would like to refer these questions to the way that science engages into the public. Bourdieu talks about the jargon that scientists, mostly sociologists, have. And I think some of it are the trajectories inside the academic. When you rise through your rank, your academic rank, and get published inside the academic and not outside the academic. And I really would like to know what you're saying about that.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. These are all such great questions. This is a great group. Thank you. Well, so I think there's a lot of things, as I said in the beginning, the general survey data does not support the conclusion that there's a massive or general crisis of trust in science. But I think you're right, though, to point out that there certainly are obstacles to scientists connecting with and communicating effectively with people outside the scientific community. And to be sure, jargon is part of it, and the attitudes of academia are part of it. And I think, we all live in a world, right? And because of who we are, we obviously have to be sensitive to how our own communities affect what we work on. So I live in the United States in 2020, and I have lived through the last 20 years in a period of time where climate science and climate scientists have been attacked mercilessly by the fossil fuel interests and the interests of the ideological neoliberals who want to build a worldview in which government plays little or any role in protecting people from the harms of economic activity. And that's something that offends me deeply, both intellectually, politically, and emotionally. And so for the last 20 years, I found myself in this position of kind of being a defender of science, which is actually a little bit weird because it's not what most of us in science studies were used to being cast as. And I've had colleagues in science studies criticize me for being like too defending science. I think, what's his name? Fuller accused me of being a publicist for science, something like that. So it's kind of, I've actually found myself in a position that's a little odd. And in fact, when I first went into this field, my own father, who was a scientist, was upset because he thought that it was a sort of anti-science position. And I tried to explain to him that the way I viewed what we did was that, in a way, we were science critics, but in the sense that a theater critic or a restaurant critic is that a theater critic loves theater, but by writing a good review that also points out what's good or bad about the production, you as a theater goer can actually learn, and your experience of theater can be more well-informed. And that's kind of how I've always thought about science studies. And I wish that we actually, as a community, had that view that it's not that we're pro-science or anti-science any more than a restaurant critic would be pro or anti-food, right? But it's that food is really important, and we get a lot of pleasure out of food, and we need food. So restaurant critics make our lives better, and so do theater critics make our lives better, and a science critic could make our lives better too. And that's how I still like to think about what I do. So I have written, you know, a lot of things now that are viewed as defending science, but obviously there's a lot of things I could say about, you know, I often say, as someone who spent as much time in the scientific community, I know where a lot of bodies are buried, you know. And there was one time over dinner, I was talking about something with my daughters, and one of my daughters said, you know, if the coal industry weren't such idiots, they should hire you because you could actually tell them what's wrong with climate science, right? You know, so I think this gets back a little bit to the earlier question about the healthy skepticism. I think if we think there are areas of science that are going wrong, we absolutely should be engaged in discussing them. And in fact, I've written a couple of papers recently in which I criticized climate scientists for how they treated this question of whether there had been a pause in the warming, in the global warming. But I do think because of the world we live in, you know, I'm careful about how I make those criticisms because I also know that they can be easily taken out of context. But I definitely think that scientists use too much jargon. I think that people who don't have a lot to say sometimes dress it up in a lot of fancy language to make it seem as if it's very erudite. And I think academia does encourage that. I think if you write in plain language, there is the risk that your academic colleagues will think you're not sophisticated, right? And so you do have to grapple with that. You know, one of my colleagues at San Diego once said to me that it was amazing that I'd had as successful an academic career as I've had, considering how clearly I write. So, you know, I think we can write clearly. I don't think we need to use jargon. I think there are times when technical terms are appropriate. And I think that using technical terms to advance a sophisticated argument is always legitimate. But if you're just throwing around terms because you don't actually, because you're afraid to say it in plain language, then that I think is bad. And so I think we all need to try our best to speak in the plainest language that works to say what we need to say and to support each other in that. And as we advance as scholars, I mean, I do this with my own students to try to help them speak in the plainest language they can and still be credible as academics. And there are a lot of different strategies for that. I have a student I'm working with right now, Charlie Tyson, who's in the English department at Harvard, and we've talked explicitly about this. He and I have just written a couple of pieces for the Chronicle of Higher Education. I can send those if anyone's interested. And he and I have actually sat down and talked, how can you be a public intellectual and write about things that really matter and write about it in language that anyone can understand and also get a job? And so it's a sort of two-pronged approach. He's writing his PhD on the theme of idleness in literature. It's a very literary theme, and his literary work is very literary, and I encourage him to make that work as literary as he can, because that's what he needs to do. But he can also do this additional work. And so the question is, how do you create a kind of package? I mean, we're all complicated people, and we all have different things we want to do and say. And sometimes the way you sort that out is by having different venues for different kinds of work.
So I apologize to everyone. There are a lot of questions that people still want to ask, but we've had you for quite some time. So we're going to take one last question. Okay. Itamar, who's actually a few miles away from you. He's spending the year at Harvard in the History of Science department.
Oh, nice. Okay.
Hi, hello. Professor Oreskes, thank you very much for this really thought-provoking talk. And my question is concerning trust in science and trust in the political system. You mentioned before disinformation and the political exploitation of distrust in science by politicians. And I wonder if it succeeds because at the same time as losing trust in science, the public or parts of it has also lost its trust in the political system. Many Americans today will tell you that the system is rigged, both Republicans and Democrats. And it seems to me that those two developments are intertwined. They cannot be completely separated. And if I may give a quick example, I think a question during the vice presidential debate 2 weeks ago was a case in point. The moderator said that 50% of Americans would not take a vaccine if it was released now. And then she asked Senator Kamala Harris whether she would take a vaccine approved by the Trump administration. Now, in the past, it was really impossible to even imagine such a question being asked in a vice presidential debate in the US. And I thought that this moment really, I still think that this moment sheds light on the mutual problem of distrust, both in science and in the political system. So my question to you is, do you believe that we can really restore trust in science without also restoring faith or trust in the political system?
Yeah, well, that's a great and depressing question because you're probably right. And I did see that part of the debate. So yeah, well, maybe the best way to get at this question is to go back to the earlier question about the relationship of science and the state and the need for diversification of scientific funding. I do think that, and this is, I want to say, Etzrahi wrote about this years ago. I know Dan Metley definitely wrote about this. There was a whole bunch of literature in the 70s about this question, that if science was too closely aligned with the state, I mean, Robert Merton wrote about this too, come to think of it. I mean, this is an old question in sociology of science, right? If science is viewed as being contiguous with the values of the state, then if people reject the state, they will reject science that goes with it. And so that would be an argument for saying that it is important for scientists to think about the diversity of both people and types of scientists and structures for science, and to emphasize that, we have scientists in academia, we have scientists in the private sector, we have scientists in independent research institutes, and we have scientists in government, and we have science on different levels of government. So that might be helpful for people who are suspicious of government. But of course, the problem is that the scientists in academia are mostly funded by government, right? And so it would be an argument for thinking about diversifying funding sources to the extent that that could be done. But also for scientists talking more about who they are as people and pointing out that scientists themselves have a very great diversity of viewpoints. Because I do think we have evidence that people often do view scientists as kind of monolithic, right? There's the scientist, right? And of course, that's not true. Scientists are extraordinarily diverse, as are many other groups of people. And if you can articulate that diversity, that can sometimes be helpful. And the thing I'm thinking about here now is going back to the evolutionary biology question. So many evangelical Christians assume that all scientists are atheists. Well, of course, that's not true. So if you can articulate that there's actually a very wide variety of religious belief among biologists, that can help to sort of break down this monolithic vision. So maybe that would be a piece that could help, at least to some degree. But you're right, it's a very difficult question. And I think you're right that this situation we're in is not going to be remedied quickly.
I'm glad we ended on a difficult question for which we don't have an answer. That's probably the best way to end this discussion. It's always a pleasure to see you, Naomi.
Likewise.
Thank you so much, and a pleasure to pick your brain. And I'm particularly happy that you sort of, you're kind of our false swallow, a kind of harbinger of the discussions that we're going to have in the department, particularly for the newcomers, a lot of whom ask questions today. So it's a wonderful introduction for the very rich and important and relevant field of science studies. So thanks so much for being with us this evening.
You're welcome. It's been a pleasure. And if there is anything people want to follow up on, maybe, or just send me an email, remind me, and I'll send you links or PDFs or other things. So.
With pleasure.
All right. All right. Yeah. Take care. You're welcome, everyone. Good to see everyone.
Thank you.
Hope to come to Israel again sometime.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.